When I first read this legend, I was under the impression that Baldr was killed by Hodr strapping a rocket to his foot and then lighting it, like, Toy Story style. But when it launched, he had only tied down his big toe, and so it became disconnected and soared across the room, and thus Baldr was killed by a mistletoe. Hodr is a deity about which very little is known, and part of the reason for this mystery is both how little there is, how much that information is corrupted, and how much that available information contains contradictions between the various stories. Hodr is a mysterious deity wrapped up in two epic stories. He is immensely strong, but in one story he is depicted as blind and easily manipulated. In another, he is a great warrior who even defeated Thor. In one story, he is a man who stands against the gods and faces the consequences. In another, he stands among the gods, after Ragnarok, in harmony with his killer. The most popular story featuring Hodr is one where he is the blind god, and his blindness serves in the myth as a weakness which Loki exploits, making him the unwitting victim of Loki's manipulation. But there is another story that feels as if it is more from Hodr's perspective. He is not blind in this legend. Instead, he is a great warrior who dares stand against the gods. The massive difference between these legends has been a matter of debate for some time, with favor given to Snorri's telling of the story in his Edda. So I'm going to tell you both stories of Hodr, which are very, very different. We'll start with Snorri's story and Icelandic tradition, which is the more popular tale. The story begins with Baldr being haunted by dreams of his own death. Odin and Frigg both respond, but a little differently. The Poetic Edda, not Snorri's Edda, but an Icelandic story consistent with his telling, discusses Odin's response as he goes into the underworld and resurrects an old seeress to find the secrets of the future. She's a little cranky from being awoken, and says, "Which man is that, unknown to me, who makes me travel this difficult road? I was snowed upon, I was rained upon, dew fell on me, dead I have been for a long time." Odin lies about his identity and proceeds to extract information from her. Among the things he learns are that Baldr will be killed by Hodr, and that Vali will be born to exact vengeance upon him. She tells him that Vali will not wash his hands nor comb his hair until he is brought to the pyre, Baldr's enemy. Frigg, however, responds a little differently. Rather than seeking out information as to the specific culprit of death, she seeks to eliminate the tool which may bring about such a death. She makes every object in the universe swear to never bring harm to Baldr, except for that of mistletoe, which she finds too young to make such an oath. The other gods kind of figure this out, and the effect is seen as quite humorous. If you throw a stone at Baldr, the stone just goes nope, and it fucks off without harming Baldr in the slightest. This was generally seen as hilarious, but Loki, who appears to be a deity strongly associated with balance, considers this to be an affront. He seems to shapeshift into a handmaiden and then discusses the matter with Frigg, asking why this is all taking place. And Frigg tells the handmaiden, Loki in disguise, "Weapons and wood will not hurt Baldr. I have received oaths from them all." However, Frigg lets slip that she had, in fact, exempted mistletoe from her endeavor because the plant was too young. Enter Hodr, the blind god. Not much is known of Hodr beyond this story and his trait as he relates to Icelandic myth. The mentions of him are all very closely related to this story. Even his kennings cite him as the enemy of Baldr, or the blind god. Snorri introduces him in his Edda as a god with immense strength, but one that the other gods would prefer not be named due to his hand in the death of Baldr. The source of his blindness is unknown, and what that blindness may represent is also unknown. Even with these strong condemnations of Hodr throughout the various texts, Snorri's story depicts a Hodr who seems blameless and at the whims of Loki's manipulation. Loki sees Hodr alone and asks why he's not joining in on the fun. And Hodr says, well, that this is simply because he cannot see Baldr, and also because he has no weapon. Loki happily provides a solution to both of these problems. In what Snorri describes as the most unlucky of deeds, Loki points Hodr in the direction of Baldr and places a sharpened stick of mistletoe in the hands of Hodr. which isn't how mistletoe works, but that's beside the point. Loki says to Hodr that he may follow the example of others and do Baldr honor in demonstrating his invincibility. Hodr, with his immense strength, launches the mistletoe and kills Baldr then and there. Snorri goes on to describe the aftermath. None could take vengeance in that moment due to their presence in a place of peace, a frith, a sanctuary, where no harm should be done to another. And yet, Hodr had broken this sacred agreement of place. A son of Odin had killed a son of Odin in the sanctuary of the gods. This brings to mind deaths that have taken place in sacred spaces in Norse myth. A most sacred of places in Icelandic culture was the Thing, or the Althing, gatherings of chieftains in which decisions would be made and disputes would be settled. It was an affront to the gods and to the people to bring your weapons within the Thing or the Althing. But there are instances in which people would draw their blades at this sacred gathering. One example in the saga of Burnt Njal involves several people doing so and a small battle taking place in the midst of this sacred place. Now, interestingly, there is a Celtic tale called the Death of Fergus that was likely an inspiration point for Snorri because of its incredible similarity. I covered this in depth in my video on Vithar and Vali, and I'll play a clip just now, just because this story is as relevant for Vali as it is for Hodr, as this incident is the catalyst for the rivalry between Hodr and Vali. And this is the incident for which Vali must have his revenge. There is, however, a very interesting story from Celtic tradition that may explain some of the differences between Saxo's story and Snorri's story of Hodr and Baldr. In the story of the Death of Fergus, the blind Luath is tricked into throwing a spear into the back of his foster brother, killing him on the spot. The man Ailill is jealous of Fergus, and while Fergus is bathing in the lake with his lady, Ailill convinces Luath that the sound of their bathing is a deer and a doe, and Luath suggests slaying them, and Ailill suggests that Luath be the one to throw the spear. And Luath says to just hand him the spear and point him in the right direction. Ailill does so, and Luath throws the spear straight through Fergus. So compare that to Snorri's story of Hodr killing Baldr, and we might recognize a few parts of this, as Loki leads Hodr to Baldr, hands him the mistletoe, and then directs Hodr where to throw the mistletoe that kills Baldr. And yet Hodr is the one seen as the rival by Vali, not Loki. In the Celtic legend, Ailill, the one who sets up the scenario, not Luath, is seen as responsible for the killing, despite the fact that he wasn't the one who threw the spear. And there's even a version of the story in which the spear that kills Fergus is mentioned as being one of hardened holly. So it even has the plant motif. It's not exactly clear whether or not Snorri was entirely familiar with what mistletoe is. It's often brought up that mistletoe doesn't really manifest as a stick, which is what's described in the Hodr Loki version. But who knows? Maybe Hodr just has one heck of a throwing arm. Mistletoe can't really kill when thrown by a normal man, but if Hodr is throwing mass at the speed of light or something crazy, he'll do damage just about anything. Whatever the case, it seems very likely that Snorri just took this Celtic story and used it to make Hodr kill Baldr while demonizing Loki, who may have never been involved in this story in the first place. The Celtic story could have also organically influenced Icelandic tradition independent of Snorri. We'll never know. I honestly think that a significant part of the practice of heathenry is yelling incoherently at historical records for their habit of incomplete information. It's certainly a part of my spirituality. Easter egg, I'm wearing the same damn outfit, but at least the books are changing on the bookshelf. Saxo's telling of Hodr's story is immensely different. In his story, Hodr and Baldr are both humans, though Baldr is described as a demigod. The story begins with the murder of Hodr's father, and how he was raised as a foster child in the royal home of the king. As a child, he would surpass all his foster brothers with his immense strength. In addition, he had a variety of skills. He was an incredible archer, swimmer, and what may have been a form of wrestling. And further, Hodr was skilled in the musical arts. Saxo associates him with the lute and the harp. The harp thing is interesting because, interestingly, a lot of people associate Bragi with the harp, but there's no actual textual evidence associating him with the harp. However, we have this evidence of Hodr being associated with the harp, which means he's more associated with the harp than Bragi is. So to harp on it further, the king's daughter, Nanna, who is also here very different than she is in Icelandic myth, finds herself taken by Hodr's many accomplishments and attributes, and she falls in love with him. Saxo describes her as seeking out his embraces, and then goes on a small commentary about love and how diverse its reasons can be. In this commentary, Saxo seems to suggest that Hodr wasn't the most good-looking of people, but that his bravery and accomplishments seems to have inspired Nanna's love. He points out that love has 1,001 entrances, and that one's bravery can sometimes be more attractive than the most handsome of looks. Baldr, however, manages to catch sight of Nanna bathing and then falls instantly in love. This seems to be a reference to any number of possible stories. To those familiar with the Bible, it calls to mind the story of David and Bathsheba. It may also be a reference to Freyr's falling in love with Garthur. Saxo's way with words strikes again here, saying that the sheen of her graceful body inflamed him, and that his heart was seared, for there was no stronger incitement to lust than beauty. It is in this moment that Baldr decides that Hodr is his only obstacle in possessing Nanna for himself, and he therefore resolved to kill him. Pro tip: Saxo's History of the Danes is meant to be read overdramatically, because you gotta match that man's energy. That's how he writes. After this, there is a description of a mythical experience from Hodr. While on a hunt, he finds the hidden cabin of 3 forest maidens. And this seems to be part of a literary trope that appears in several stories and is even referenced in Shakespeare's Macbeth. They invited him into their home and informed Hodr of Baldr's intentions and urged him not to fight the demigod. After this advice was given, they and their home disappeared, and Hodr found himself as he had been before, in the midst of the forest. Hodr returns home and immediately asks for Nanna's hand in marriage. The king responds that he would have favored him, but that Baldr had already asked, and he had no interest in offending the demigod. However, if Hodr found the courage to take this matter into his own hands, that there was a magic sword that could give him a fighting chance against Baldr. It was, however, in the possession of a satyr, which also had a magical bracelet capable of increasing his own wealth. And this may be a reference to Odin's famous arm ring, Draupnir. Hodr would go into the woods and find the satyr, and with his immense strength, he would wound him with a spear, and then threaten the satyr with torture until he gave up his treasures. And the satyr gave over the treasures and escaped, and Saxo explains that this is because nothing is dearer than breath to mortal creatures. And with this magical sword and wealth-enhancing bracelet, Hodr returned to the kingdom. Word of Hodr's newfound power spread through the various kingdoms, and this precipitated into a series of battles, in which we find one of the literary references to the Viking shield wall. Saxo records that Hodr's troops interlocked their shields into the pattern of a tortoise shell to protect themselves from arrows. From these victories, Hodr gained fame and renown. In the midst of these events, Baldr armed himself and entered the king's territory to claim Nanna. The king told Baldr that he must hear Nanna's feelings from herself, and invited Baldr to ask Nanna for her hand in marriage. Nanna, however, would refuse the demigod. Baldr demanded her reasoning, and according to Saxo, she responded that a god could not possibly wed a mortal, as the huge discrepancy in their natures would preclude any congruous union between them. She further explains that the power imbalance between them was great, and that the gods were in the habit of suddenly revoking their contracts with inferiors. Thus, their union could not last because of this imbalance. Nanna explains that she had no interest in being subjected to the whims of an unequal partner, and so avoided any agreement with Baldr. Honestly, this passage is interesting for Saxo because Nanna is provided incredible agency for women in this time period. This passage shows one of the few exceptions in Norse storytelling in which a woman is given agency in her own marriage. Often women were at the whims of the diplomatic desires of their fathers, but notably in this case, and in the case of another based and consent-informed Viking father named Kettle Salmon, consent of the daughter is required. However, Saxo may have included this note because of his desire to demonize Baldr, which is clearly his goal in this story, in his depiction of Baldr as impatient and entitled. As a result, we see Saxo praise the cleverness of Nanna, whereas his opinion on women is usually condemning their emotional whims and attraction to power, as if those aren't common traits of men as well. In response to this, Baldr massed an army to invade, and so too did Hodr with the help of local kings. But on Baldr's side stood Thor and other deities. Lightning showered from the sky and shattered the shields of his opponents. Saxo writes that no armor could stand against his club, presumed to be Mjolnir, which would smash through helmets and shields. No defense would withstand the mighty weapon. Size and muscle mattered not against the god of strength. Finally, Thor faced off against Hodr and his legendary sword. Through blasts of lightning and mighty Mjolnir, Hodr landed a single strike, cutting down the size of Thor's hammer at the handle. Thor's onslaught is halted immediately, and Thor seemed to recognize Hodr's resolve. With this unexpected show of strength, Thor and the other gods retreated, and Baldr was left abandoned. Baldr was forced to retreat, and his fleet was utterly destroyed. He found himself haunted in the night by specters taking the form of Nanna, and resolved that no victory would be worth his time unless it was a victory that secured him Nanna. The shame of his prior defeat was too great, and he could not let it stand. Following the battle, Hodr would marry Nanna and become king, which further added to the insult to Baldr's honor. Thus, a new series of battles began between the two. Baldr invaded Hodr's kingdom with a new army and won a series of battles without the aid of Thor, but seemed to grow no closer to Nanna, his ultimate prize. In these defeats, Hodr had ceded his lands in Daneland except for Jutland, the large peninsula of modern-day Denmark. Baldr's victories across Denmark's islands weighed heavily on Hodr, who found himself sunk into a deep depression. He found himself wandering as far as Sweden without escort, and grew to loathe life and sunlight. Saxo comments that sometimes men who experience overwhelming grief will make for strange and unknown retreats, as if this will provide an antidote for their sadness. They find themselves retreating from society, for solitude is generally a friend to the heartsick. Eventually on his travels, he happened upon a cave, inside which dwelt mysterious maidens, the same maidens from earlier who had cautioned him about Baldr. Saxo remarks that they had once given him an impenetrable coat, apparently at the first meeting before they disappeared, or perhaps some other meeting. Saxo, however, had neglected to mention this earlier. So apparently for a significant portion of this story, Hodr had been rolling around with an impenetrable armor, which I'm sure was helpful throughout this story. These maidens are widely agreed upon to be Valkyries. They describe themselves as invisibly present on battlefields, and that their job was to control the functions of war with their blessings. Valkyries will sometimes show up in stories with gifts and blessings for warriors. And in the case of Hodr, it seems that they gave him an impenetrable coat somewhere along his journey. Whatever the case, they share secrets of Baldr's invincibility. Apparently, he has some secret munchies that gift him the ability to remain unharmed. So, instead of Frigg going around and getting oaths, in Saxo's version, Baldr was sneaking away with delicious invincibility snacks. So, Hodr wound up yoinking the snacks. He found that the maidens themselves seemed to be who was delivering the sacred meals to Baldr. And the interesting thing here is that Hodr's next actions don't really seem to have a plan. He just kind of goes for it. Hodr masses an army and then makes his moves to attack Baldr. Baldr, too, amassed his own army, and the two armies met, ready to face off. Hodr was restless the night before battle, and he decided, instead of sleeping, that he would just sneak into Baldr's camp. He disguised himself as a minstrel playing a lyre, which may or may not have been the instrument authentic to legend, but it's what Saxo wrote down. Whatever the case, he finds the maidens in Baldr's camp, and the text is a little unclear here, and it also has a literal hole in the turning point of the conversation between Hodr and the maidens, who, when he discovers them, do not want to help him, but somehow are convinced to help him, and he walks away with a magic belt and sabotages Baldr's snack supply. How does he accomplish this? Well, that's the part that's missing. I guess the climax of this story is rather interesting. Hodr is walking out of the camp in his disguise and happens across Baldr, chilling, having a time, and Hodr just decides, well, I guess I'm here, and stabs Baldr with his sword, throwing him to the ground, half dead. And Hodr, ever the opportunist it seems, then escaped from the camp and got back to his soldiers, who rejoiced in the news. Imagine being one of Hodr's soldiers, and it's the night before battle, and stressed out, full of anxiety. And Hodr comes up and tells you the news, and you just go, "You stabbed him? It's in the battle tomorrow? Why do I have a watch?" Baldr knew that the wound was deep and that it looked bad. He spoke to his men, deciding that they would attack the next day. He announced that he would take the front line to dispel the notion that he simply lay dying in his tent. The battle raged through the day, after which Baldr collapsed into his bed. His dreams became nightmares, and Hel, the goddess of death, appeared to him in his dream and let him know that he had 3 days to live, and that after that he would be in her possession. Over those days, Baldr did not fight in battle. His pain became more and more severe. After 3 days, as foretold, Baldr died of his wounds. A great funeral was held, but whereas Snorri placed Baldr's funeral within the context of a sea burial on a burning ship, Saxo's Baldr is placed in a burial mound. Interestingly, Saxo comments that the burial mound was cursed, and that when grave robbers attempted to raid the mound for the treasures within, the guardian spirits responded with water gushing out of the tomb and flooding the entire area. After this story, through mode of a prophecy, Vali, or as Saxo calls him, Bo, is born. Vali demonstrates a thirst for battle, and is called before Odin to fulfill his duty to his family and kill Hodr. Vali accepts this charge and goes to challenge Hodr in single combat. Hodr secures his line of succession and then goes out to accept the duel, announcing that he knew he would die. Saxo doesn't drag out the details of the fight, and says that Bo/Vali kills Hodr. Vali is then brought home on his shield. Hodr dealt severe wounds to Vali before his death, and Vali would die of his wounds shortly thereafter. As you can see, these stories are filled to the brim with differences. Now, as a heathen, I think that there's reasonable cause to prefer at least elements of Saxo's story, but it's important to take into considerations the biases of each author in this case. Saxo had plenty of motivation to demonize the gods. Throughout multiple passages in the text, Saxo denies that the gods are gods, frames them as wizards, articulates the people following them as gullible or stupid, and weaves parables illustrating the irrationality of pagans. As such, you can see in this story that Thor is painted as a brute carrying out the will of Odin. Hodr's victory against him is seen as a victory for humanity against those arrogant beings who call themselves gods. Baldr, too, is demonized as arrogant, but also as jealous and driven by lust to take marriage with Nanna, who expresses that she does not want him. Snorri's story is different. He doesn't express the same hatred for heathen beliefs that Saxo does. But his story seems to import an almost identical Celtic myth and tells a story that doesn't seem compatible with other aspects of the text. Hodr is named in other texts as the one responsible for the death of Baldr, but the depiction of that death seems to show that the responsibility for that death is Loki, with Hodr as his unwitting tool. Now, there are complications in where that responsibility is meant to be placed in Icelandic law. Similar to American law, there is distinction between one who commits the act and one who conspires the act. But in this case, we see someone without intention and who is used unwittingly by a conspirator. It's pretty obvious where the responsibility truly lies, and it seems that the gods would have access to this kind of analysis. This responsibility of Hodr seems to come into play in the moments after Ragnarok, in which both Baldr and Hodr are revived. They sit among the remaining gods, along with Vali, Vithor, and the sons of Thor. Vengeance on Hodr has been fulfilled. Thus, Hodr no longer needs to die for the death of Baldr and can carry on with his sins absolved. Though this aspect of the story, much like Ragnarok itself, seems to contain heavy influences both from Christian tradition and the Christian writers themselves. That, however, probably needs its own video to unpack. Now, Saxo's story, despite the biases that I mentioned earlier, contain so many elements that seem unique to a story of struggle between Baldr and Hodr. Saxo does seem to embellish the tale. Several elements of it, including aspects that he uses to demonize the gods, are taken from another story of Wayland the Smith. But much of it seems to reflect an authentic legend of rivalry between Hodr and Baldr, which would explain the passages in Icelandic texts and poems holding Hodr responsible. Personally, I think that the Saxo legend is probably more authentic. This is just my opinion, but I think that there's elements to the story that can be borrowed to get a realistic view of Hodr. His associations with instruments might have made him a music deity of sorts, and his strength and prowess in battle is hardly out of place in the Norse pantheon, which has no shortage of war gods. But there's two major obvious differences. One is Hodr's blindness, and the other is the involvement of Loki. Now, was Hodr's blindness authentic to Norse belief? Probably. Snorri records among Hodr's kennings the blind god, along with the enemy of Baldr. His blindness may have been a part of a legend that Saxo didn't pick up, or it could be an element of a changing myth between the Danes and the Icelanders. It could also be that it's a creative addition of Snorri, as it's only confirmed in his own text. Now, interestingly, the Poetic Edda makes no mention of Hodr's blindness, but it does point out Hodr's responsibility towards Baldr's death. Now, for the involvement of Loki. Saxo's story makes no mention of Loki, though there is a satyr from which Hodr receives his sword. Hodr, however, is active in this, rather than being set up by the satyr. Hodr, throughout the story, is his own agent, and isn't easily manipulated. In fact, he dons disguises and sneaks around himself, eventually killing Baldr by happenstance, but on purpose. It's possible that Loki became a part of this story through the evolution of storytelling between the Danes and the Icelanders. Loki's presence is felt most in Icelandic myth, more so than any other tradition of heathenry, in some of which he is simply absent. But personally, I think that it's reasonable to conclude that Loki may be authentic to an Icelandic legend of the death of Baldr, but perhaps he was a companion of Hodr seeking balance in the story. But the myth was likely not as Snorri paints it. I think that his version seems far too influenced by the death of Fergus. So, what would a more authentic legend of Hodr look like? Well, it's impossible to tell, really, and there were likely varieties across traditions. My view is that Saxo's legend may be the more authentic legend of the tale, but it is dripping with Saxo's biases. Loki may have been involved in some versions of the legend, maybe absent in others. His statements in other areas of Icelandic myth suggest that he was at the very least involved in the death of Baldr. I think, however, that Hodr bears more responsibility in the myth than Snorri's story implies. The legend that was told by Icelanders prior to Snorri likely held a balance between Loki's statements of involvement and the vigor with which revenge is sought on Hodr. Perhaps Loki's involvement in this story has something to do with Hodr's blindness, given that this is also unique to the Icelandic version of the myth. That aspect, however, may have been imported from the Celtic legend, but an existing story of Hodr's blindness may have been part of the reason why Snorri was inspired to incorporate the death of Fergus in the first place, assuming that's what he did. Loki may have also been incorporated into the plot of Hodr disguising himself, but this is pontificating on a legend to which we do not have access and may have never even existed. We simply cannot know, but it's worth considering when looking at the stories. Now, if Loki's involvement does have something to do with Hodr's blindness, I think it would go something like this. Perhaps the legend has some of the elements of Saxo's legend, but with Loki filling in the role of the maidens. Perhaps Hodr was the jealous one, which is why Nanna chooses to be with Baldr in Icelandic myth. Loki, as a balancing god, has a history of gifting but sometimes sabotaging his own gifts in the interests of reasonable balance. Mjolnir comes to mind. He might see the invincibility of Baldr as offensive, but not wish to grant too much power to his killer. Perhaps Loki offered a deal, the ability to kill Baldr, but with the sacrifice to Hodr's sight. But let me know where you're at on this legend. And further, what would this mean for Nanna? Snorri places her in Helheim as the devoted wife of Baldr. Saxo places her as the devoted wife of Hodr, who refuses Baldr, and then we have no information about her fate in Saxo's story. It's unfortunate that we don't have more information to settle these matters. If only we had more versions or records of the tale. But as it stands, we do not. We have two narratives of this story, each with their own problems. To me, any definitive statements that rest on Saxo's or Snorri's tellings of the death of Baldr must be tempered with the uncertainty around these issues. Villainizing Loki or Hodr may be a step too far. Fate has considerable weight in the sagas and in myth, and the death of Baldr may be a point that was necessary to balance these various forces. It's easy to imagine that Loki's primary motivation was taking offense to the imbalance of Baldr's invincibility, and perhaps Loki provided Baldr's enemy, Hodr, with the tools to regain that balance. But of course, we'll never know for sure. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Be sure to like this vid if you enjoyed it, and the subscribe button and the like button are attempting to kill each other with a mistletoe, but failing, because that's just not how mistletoe works. Be sure to ring the bell for more heathen content, and remember to find a way or make one. I'm sure that in broader heathenry, this video will low-key cause drama.